I'll go ahead and start us off. My name is Emily Schwiniger. I am the Deputy Director of Thriving Communities at Smart Growth America. And we are here today in order to launch our virtual workshop, Complete Streets for Complete Communities. We've been working very closely with partners in Charlotte with Rayo Community Health and Sustain Charlotte. And I know that we have a few important local leaders on the call or in the room, as I like to say today. So I'd like to hand it over to Sustain to let us know who's here and give them a few minutes for some opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm Meg Fensel. I'm the program director at Sustain Charlotte. I believe we have most of our staff with us today. Sustain Charlotte is a local nonprofit organization, and we work to advance smart growth principles in the Charlotte area. So we want to make sure that everybody has access to all of the benefits of our community. And we know that that takes really smart land use and transportation planning. So I would like to introduce two VIPs that we have with us today. Taiwo Jayoba is the assistant city manager of Charlotte and also the director of planning, design, and development. And I'd like for him to just say a few words about why he's here today and what he values in Charlotte.
Hey, I'm Meg. Thank you so much for the invite. This is great. I appreciate Sustain Charlotte for keeping our eyes on the ball of smart planning, smart growth as a city. And I know that this has 4 modules. I'm only going to be able to join you for the first few minutes today, but I will definitely find one of the modules where I will be fully present and participate. This is great. Again, want to thank you. I do know that, you know, the notion of smart growth acknowledges that growth is going to happen, right? But it just has to happen in a sustainable, equitable, resilient manner. And so in Charlotte, we've been working on how can we become less auto-centered, but more people-focused in the places that we create, in our buildings, on our streets, in the open spaces. We're going to see more of that. As our comprehensive plan is moving forward, we know land use has to be tied with mobility. So Sustain Charlotte is part of our Charlotte Moves task force that Mayor Lyles put together earlier this year. And the meeting is going to be on Thursday, shameless plug, at 6 p.m. On CDC YouTube and Facebook. But the neat thing about this meeting is we're going to be learning lessons from Nashville, Broward County, and Austin. Because all of them, Nashville failed a transit referendum a couple years ago. Austin is putting one together for this November. Broward County passed a $15.6 billion referendum about a year or 2 ago. And we will be listening to all 3 of them as to how they're thinking smart planning, smart growth, but also making sure that they link land use with public transit and walkability, as well as pedestrian-focused activities. So I'm really happy to be part of this. And I just want to say thank you, Shannon, and your team for what you're doing to keep our eyes focused on really making Charlotte a beautiful place. It's complete street, healthy street, and we'll continue to make sure that we champion that on this hand of a public agency. So once again, thanks for the invite. I'll hang on for a few more minutes, but I'll drop off soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taiwo. And I attend a lot of virtual transportation meetings for the city, and I can tell you Taiwo is at all of them. So he really has a good pulse on what's going on with planning from both the land use and the transportation and the economic mobility perspective. So he's the person who is really tying everything together, and we really appreciate your leadership, Taiwo. I would now like to introduce Commissioner Susan Harden. Susan serves on the Mecklenburg Board of County Commissioners. She represents District 5, which is South Charlotte. She also serves as the chair of the Metropolitan Transit Commission, which is the governing body of CATS. And she serves on the Intergovernment Relations Committee, the Economic Development Committee, and the Audit Committee. So she's very busy, and we really appreciate that she has joined us for the workshop. So I'd like you to say a few words.
Well, thank you, and really excited to learn from you today about smart growth. I can tell you that, you know, on the county commission, our job is to provide for the human services for our community. And if we can get smart growth right, we'll be able to do our job so much better. And so the decisions we make in terms of how we manage growth has you can draw a straight line to the job that we do in the provision of our health and human services. So these decisions are critical. often, regrettably, we feel somewhat separate from those on the county commission, and we need to do a better job, I think, of making sure that those growth decisions are in front of the commission, because it really impacts our ability to provide human services. So thank you. Looking forward to learning today.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Harden. We really appreciate you being here, and for also your leadership and coordinating city and county efforts is very important. So thank you.
Well, great. Thank you. We're so glad to have such high-level support. It's really indicative of the great work that is happening on the ground in Charlotte. I do want to add that I am from up the road in Greensboro, North Carolina. That is where my family is, and that is where I was raised. So I do feel really excited to be here virtually in Charlotte today, and I really appreciate everybody joining us. So just again, really quickly, a couple of housekeeping items. As I said before, please make sure that you're on mute for everybody's better enjoyment of audio. Also, I wanted to add that we have decided very intentionally to hold this meeting on Zoom because we want it to be interactive. So please feel free to use the chat box if you have questions, concerns, comments. I've seen people already using reactions, claps, thumbs up. And please don't hesitate to take yourself off mute if you have something to share with us. Always please let us know your name, your affiliation, so we have a sense of, you know, who you are and who you're, you know, what your experience is as you share out with us. Once again, my name is Emily Schwiniger. I am the Deputy Director of Smart Growth America. And just a little bit about, you know, what we're going to be doing today. Actually, if I can ask my colleague Cole, who I'll introduce in just a minute, to start our presentation. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce, you know, why we're here today. So we are Smart Growth America. We're here with also the National Complete Streets Coalition, and we envision a country where no matter where you live, no matter who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And as you can see, we are a family of programs. So you may be familiar with some of the programs that fall under the Smart Growth America umbrella, such as I mentioned before, the National Complete Streets Coalition. We also house Transportation for America, State Smart Transportation Initiative, Locus, and others. The work that we do at Smart Growth America and the sort of theory of change that we use is we provide technical assistance, much like this workshop that we are providing today. We also provide advocacy work. We do a lot of advocacy work on the Hill around federal legislation, and we are thought leaders in this space. So, you know, this is a sort of, these three pieces all are interconnected. They feed into one another. So to be clear that this technical assistance that we provide here, it's an opportunity for us to bring in experts into the room, and I'll introduce them in a minute who you're going to be hearing from during these 4 modules. But these experts have experience across the entire country. They have experience on the Hill, but they also have experience in communities throughout our nation. And so they can bring those shared best practices into the room with us. And then seeing what we see on the ground, we determine what sort of reports. We have signature reports I'll talk about more in a minute, and other sort of ways that we can guide thoughts and discussion around smart growth, around, in this case, complete streets, and other strategies around land use, economic development, and transportation, particularly always founded in this sort of understanding that it all has to be equity-based. The reason that we are able to be here with you today and our partnership with Rayo Community Health and Sustain Charlotte is part of the Active People Healthy Nation initiative, which is part of CDC's Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity. This initiative is attempting to get 27 million more Americans more physically active by 2027, with the understanding, of course, that increased physical activity can improve health, quality of life, and reduce healthcare costs across the country. We know that there's a huge problem in the United States. We're all aware that not enough people are getting out, not enough people are physically active. And this approach really takes into account the idea that part of the issue is the built environment, and that we need to be ensuring, Cole, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we know that the problem is not enough people are physically active. You can see some statistics here, some numbers. You know, I mean, this part of the conversation is something that's just sort of very much a reality and understood across the country. Next slide. So what we also understand that this is something that affects people at all stages of life. So too few Americans get the recommended amount of physical activity, but it's also looking at how, you know, what we think would be, you know, our vision for safe and plentiful opportunities for physical activity for everyone, beginning at children, school age, and moving through the ages into older adults. And as you can see here, there are a variety of different approaches and ways that we're looking at how to improve the built environment, looking at land use, looking at different strategies, tools, in order to create spaces that are more conducive for physical activity for everyone. The Active People, Healthy Nation initiative has a series of specific strategies the CDC is supporting. And the one that we are here to talk about today is activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. You'll probably hear that said a few times during these workshops. And it is all about, you know, what you imagine: complete streets. It's about land use. It's about safe routes to school, zoning policies, and other ways that we can improve the physical environment to provide more opportunities for that physical activity. And I want to point your attention to the bottom of this signpost, because there's a lot of different strategies that are being supported and implemented through this initiative. But I want to make sure that we're all in a clear understanding that it's all based in a foundation of equitable and inclusive access, which we will talk about throughout this series of modules. So if we look a little more closely at activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, this is the piece that we're going to be talking about today and over the coming weeks. And what that is in this case, the way we're going to frame it, is about complete streets. So complete streets are for everyone. They're designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, cyclists, motorcyclists, transit riders, and riders of all ages and abilities. It makes it easier to cross the street, walk to shops, bike to work. It allows buses to run on time. It makes it safer for people to walk to and from transit, first mile, last mile connections. And you can see an example here of a space that is one picture of a complete street. We want to emphasize that we believe that the complete streets approach can be used in all different types of communities, from large to small, from rural to urban, and we can talk about that in more depth as we go along. Additionally, it's important to understand complete streets is not a product. It's not an intersection. It's not one corridor. It's a process. So it's the approach of complete streets allows a community to use every opportunity moving forward. Every time you're repaving a street, every time you're designing and building a new development, you can use the complete streets approach to look at and consider how to make that project or that space more accessible, safer for all users of all abilities, and considering equity and who those users are and what the obstacles may be for certain people in order to access and enjoy the benefits of the project that you're talking about. So it is a process. Now, today and throughout this workshop series, I should take a moment and say, I want to thank everybody for joining us on Zoom. Normally, we would be coming to Charlotte. We would spend a couple of days in the community. But of course, we all know that we are living in very strange and challenging times. So on that note, I do want to say, I hope everyone is safe and well where they are. And I thank you again for joining us virtually. We have done our best to shift this model of an in-person workshop, which is obviously sort of that invaluable face-to-face time, into this mode. Again, why we choose Zoom and not just provide a webinar series or something of the sort is because we see this as a learning exchange. We have objectives, of course. We have worked closely with our partners in Charlotte to scope out and define this piece of work that we're doing. We have these 3 clear objectives around understanding complete streets, the role of land use, looking at making it accessible to vulnerable communities, and then we are going to end looking at existing plans, policies, procedures, and our final piece looking at a specific case study in Charlotte. And in addition, again, this is a learning exchange, just to emphasize that point. When I said, please take yourself off mute and interject, please don't be shy. We are here to share the best practices that we gather from around the country. We are here, we will bring in experts, who have a great deal of experience from being local leaders themselves or from other pieces of the work and places from which they come. But we want to learn from you as well. All of this is a learning exchange, and it will contribute to, just to be clear, we have the setup of this workshop is 4 learning modules, but then we follow up with a recommendations memo. So while we are delivering this technical assistance, we are also gathering information from you all about what's happening in Charlotte so that we can offer our recommendations about next steps and how to continue to carry the work forward, which we know Charlotte is doing a tremendous amount of work around this. So we're here not only to inform, but to be informed. And please keep that in mind as we go forward. Finally, before we jump into the content for the first module, I did want to give you a sense of who is going to be speaking with you in the next 2 weeks. So I introduced myself, Emily Schwiniger, just to give you a little bit about me. As I said, I am from North Carolina, Tar Heel. But additionally, I have a public health background. I've worked in public health for over a decade, from everything from food systems to migrant health, to working around equity, health systems, and now more recently looking at the built environment. So for me, it's a fascinating middle ground between, the sort of behavioral change piece of public health, and here we're talking about the systems piece and where we can bring those 2 things together. Additionally, today, as part of our module on benefits of complete streets, you'll be hearing from my colleague, Cole Sicaro, who is the program manager at the National Complete Streets Coalition. They are instrumental in providing support and developing and writing various of our signature reports, including Dangerous by Design and our policy report, where we grade complete street policies from across the country. The next module this week, which is on Thursday at the same time, we'll be having Beth Osborne and Chris Zimmerman talk to us about designing for active transportation and land use. Beth Osborne is the Director of Transportation for America and Vice President of Transportation at Smart Growth America. And Chris Zimmerman, who is the Vice President of Economic Development at Smart Growth America, Director of the Governor's Institute on Community Design, and was also a local leader on his county council for over 18 years in Arlington. Then next week, we'll have a module on partners and implementation. I'll be on that module again, but also joining me and leading the module will be Christopher Coase, who is the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America, and also the Director of Locus, which is the Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors organization. And finally, as part of our wrap up on implementing complete streets, where we'll be talking about a specific case study in Charlotte that we've been working with partners on the ground to develop, we'll have Eric Sundquist working with Cole Sicaro. Eric is the director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative, and we're really excited to have him with us next week. So we've got a great lineup. These are some great people to hear from, and we're looking forward to the conversations that we are able to have with them. So let me pause for one moment in case anybody has any questions about the format, if anybody has any comments, if anybody would like to say anything right now before we jump into our first module, which is, as you see on the screen, benefits of complete streets. So I'll just give people 1 second. If you have anything you'd like to add, say, ask. All right, well, when I hear silence, I just assume that it's a thumbs up and let's keep moving. Again, feel free to drop anything in the chat box. I have also, I should say, my colleague is also here, Rayla, and we have a few people who will be able to respond to those even as the presentation is going along. So feel free to jump in, ask questions, both taking yourself off mute or just in the chat box. So the benefits of complete streets. Complete streets help create livable communities for various types of users, including children, people with disabilities, older adults. They improve equity, safety, public health, and they can reduce traffic costs, traffic woes. This is going to be a basic, quick understanding of the benefits of complete streets so that we're all sort of in the same place, it's a level set, so that we can continue to have the conversation in the coming weeks. So looking at a map, as you can see, it's pretty powerful. You can see on one part of the map, on the top map, you see physical inactivity. And then on the bottom map, you can see age-adjusted diabetes prevalence. And what you see is really a reflection, one of the other. One of the most obvious and important benefits of complete streets is creating opportunities for physical activity. We can provide more opportunities for physical activity if we build them into people's daily routines. And we also know that physical activity is directly linked with a series of chronic diseases, also weight maintenance and other health issues. So, what we see is where places where people are inactive, people have more chronic diseases. And if we look at the physical benefits of physical activity, they're broad reaching. Getting enough physical activity can prevent many of the most common forms of disease, heart disease, diabetes, breast cancer, other types of cancer, and it can also improve sleep and reduce anxiety. So these are just a few of the benefits of physical activity. In addition, there's benefits that affect people at all life stages, benefits for all ages. For children, being able to walk or bike to school or the park and getting all the extra activity that comes with that leads to lower risks of depression, better aerobic and muscular fitness, better bone health, and better performance in school. Adults, physical activity lowers cardiovascular disease, improves fitness, mental health, can reduce weight gain. And then if we look at older adults particularly, you see that when people, as they are aging, are able to age in place, when they can safely walk for recreation or to get to everyday destinations, it means that they can stay in their home longer. And we know that not only the physical activity, that the health benefits, the direct health benefits, but also the psychological benefits, the emotional benefits of being able to be mobile can really delay the onset of a lot of diseases, the onset of dementia, and certainly feelings of isolation. Unfortunately, as we know, Americans are well aware, there's a great deal of evidence, there's no denying that physical activity is currently a national crisis. Only half of adults get enough physical activity to reduce or prevent chronic diseases. And on that note, 1 in 2 adults in the United States lives with a chronic disease. So that is no coincidence. Additionally, 1 in 4 live with multiple chronic diseases. So these are some of the things that we are trying to get to the root of through the built environment and through some of these interventions, such as complete streets. If we look at the rise in obesity and chronic diseases associated with it, we see it's a nationwide crisis. And we also see, it's important to point out, there is an urban and rural divide. You know, what we see is obesity is more prevalent in rural areas where physical activity levels tend to be lower compared to urban ones. You can see in non-metropolitan counties, 34.2%, and in metropolitan counties, 28.7%. I think it's really important to keep this disparity in mind as we discuss strategies for creating activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. You know, this rural versus urban is two ends of a spectrum, but we also know that in places like Charlotte and in North Carolina, you know, we're throwing in questions and concerns about how to manage suburban areas as well and what that looks like. So besides promoting physical activity, Complete Streets also offers other important benefits for community health. For example, when we design our transportation network to make walking, biking, and riding public transit safer, more convenient, more accessible, people are more likely to choose these lower emission options instead of driving alone. When enough people choose these lower emission options, that means fewer harmful emissions in our air, which reduces the rates of asthma and other respiratory diseases. Additionally, and we will talk about this in more depth, but here is the beginning of the conversation around safety. You know, if they can be shared more safely, if designing streets can be safer for all users and reduce the number of severity of crashes, then we're talking about fewer deaths and serious injuries on our roadways. Unfortunately, what we see if we look at Dangerous by Design, one of our signature reports, what we see is that there's been an increase in pedestrian fatalities and in comparison to vehicle miles traveled in the last several years. We believe this is unacceptable, and we're doing the good work to reveal this, to point it out, to call it out, and we want to talk about all the different strategies that we can utilize to change this trend. And if you look at the entire country, much like the map that you saw earlier around physical inactivity, chronic disease, what we see here is a direct mirror, almost, of dangerous states for pedestrians. This is where crashes are killing more pedestrians throughout the country. And it is along the same belt line within the United States, the Sun Belt, as they might call it in some ways. And if you look closely at North Carolina, not the worst, but not the best. 13th in the country, at 13th most dangerous state in the country. So that's something that we definitely want to keep in mind as we are talking to others about the importance of complete streets and the strategies that we are discussing in this workshop. So beyond the health benefits, beyond safety and other things along that line, we also can talk about economic benefits. You know, aside from that, public health, you know, Complete Streets develops active and walkable communities, and this can build new jobs, support businesses, increase retail sales, and more. A study that we put together analyzed 37 complete street projects around the country in order to understand their economic impact. And what we found was that projects supporting walking and biking actually reduced crashes and injuries, as well as the costs associated with them. These projects also boosted employment levels, property values, investment from the private sector, and net new businesses. And these projects collectively averted in 1 year more than 18 million in property damage and healthcare costs. This was just from these 37 projects in our sample. So the cost of collisions and injuries nationwide is in the billions of dollars annually. Complete Streets has the potential to avert hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in collision costs if they are implemented on a larger scale, especially on our most dangerous streets. So again, there are a variety of different benefits to Complete Streets. Here we've named a few. I want us to have an opportunity to talk in more depth about the disparities in the built environment. And we have Cole Sakaro, who I'd like to hand it over to continue that conversation. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to open it up again. If anybody has any questions, any comments before I hand it over to Cole. And just to be clear, we are planning to have a period at the end where it will be open discussion. So feel free to jump in now or hold on to your thoughts. We want to have a conversation about everything that's discussed today before we close out. And I always take silence as a good thing in this virtual landscape. I'm sure you're all still here with us. I see 45 participants, so that is really great. We're really excited for everyone who has been able to join us. And just a reminder that this is Complete Streets for Complete Communities with Smart Growth America. And I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Cole.
Thank you, Emily, and hello, everybody. As Emily explained before, I am the program manager of the National Complete Streets Coalition. Those of you with sharp ears have probably noticed already that I use they, them pronouns. And much like Emily, I also come from a background in public health, ranging anywhere from harm reduction to injury prevention among cycle commuters to prenatal nutrition. Today, I am going to continue what Emily began with this introductory module. So I'm going to give a bit of a broad overview of a few different topics, some of which we're going to talk about in much greater detail later, and some of which I'm introducing now because I want you to have them in mind as we move forward with other conversations because they're very relevant. I'm not going to go into too much depth with specific real-world examples today, but I and my colleagues are going to do that moving forward in other modules. And just to reiterate what Emily has already said, there will be some discussion questions built in, as well as some time at the end for Q&A and discussion. But please, if you have any questions, or if you know of any real-life examples from your own experience that relate to the things I'm going to say that you would like to share with the others on the call, please do feel free to come off of mute. Please interrupt me to share your thoughts. Or you can go ahead and put your comments in the chat, and then I just ask that one of my colleagues please go ahead and flag that because it is a little difficult to see the chat while I am sharing my screen. So Emily talked you through the broad-reaching benefits of complete streets and having this opportunity to build physical activity into your daily life, usually in the case of complete streets in the form of transportation. Unfortunately, it would be naive of us to assume that these benefits are distributed equitably among the community. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of existing disparities in the built environment that we're going to discuss even further in the upcoming module on land use. Starting with acknowledging the fact that the infrastructure that creates safe, walkable, bikeable streets are not currently distributed evenly. The chart that you're looking at shows the prevalence of various safety features in high-income versus low-income neighborhoods nationwide. And what you can see is that high-income neighborhoods are much more likely to have sidewalks. They're much more likely to have pedestrian-scale lighting and crosswalks and traffic calming projects, which work to encourage drivers to move at a safer, slower speed, to share the street with people that are walking along across it, biking, and so on. This is important because it has really, really important implications for safety. The graph you're looking at now is also from the report Emily mentioned earlier, Dangerous by Design. If you're not familiar with it, we'll be sure to share it with you after this module. What you're looking at are the rate of pedestrian fatalities, the rate of people struck and killed by drivers while walking based on the median household income of the place that they were walking in. And what you can see is an almost perfect correlation where at the left you see that the highest rates of people killed while walking are occurring in the lowest income neighborhoods, and the lowest rates of people being struck and killed while walking are happening in the highest income neighborhoods. This is not a coincidence. This relates very directly to the graph I showed you a moment ago about how we have built our streets and where we have introduced safety improvements and improvements for walkability in the past. I'll talk a bit more about why this has happened in a little while. What I do want you to keep in mind from the onset is that historically and even in the present, some of the decisions that we have made about transportation have not held the best interests of the most vulnerable in mind. For example, the national highway system, when it was built, disproportionately cleared, divided, and cut directly through low-income communities of color, especially low-income Black neighborhoods. This also is not a coincidence. What you're seeing here is that we made a decision as a country to prioritize the movement of people coming from suburbs, people moving in cars, over the safety, well-being, and access to resources for people who are living in these neighborhoods. People who, as I mentioned, may be lower income or may be more likely to be people of color, including Black or Latinx. We prioritize the speed of traveling a long distance for somebody in a car over the safety and access for somebody that is walking or biking or perhaps riding a bus. And these decisions historically have a very, very noticeable impact today. For example, what we see is major racial and ethnic disparities in who is producing pollutants and who is exposed to them. Emily mentioned earlier the health impacts of emissions from vehicles. We see that these are connected to asthma rates and other respiratory diseases. And because of the location of these major highways and roads in particular, what we see is that white non-Hispanic people tend to produce more pollutants than they are exposed to, whereas Black and Hispanic or Latinx people tend to be exposed to more pollutants than they produce. This is a very real and very direct inequity and health disparity that is largely a result of the decisions that we have made about our built environment. Similarly, these decisions have major consequences for our safety. Again, this figure is from Dangerous by Design. What you're seeing is what we call the relative pedestrian danger by race and ethnicity. This is no longer just a pedestrian fatality rate. What we're looking at here combines the number of people of different races or ethnicities killed by drivers while walking. This also accounts for the share of these races and ethnicities across our population, as well as differences in walking rates between these groups. And what we see is that disproportionately people of Native American, or according to the census, American Indian, Alaska Native ethnicity, and Black or African American people are struck and killed disproportionately. Again, this is a direct result of the way that we have built our streets and where we have or have not improved them in various communities. I want to return to this slide that Emily showed you earlier to point out that without partnerships, which we'll discuss in the third module, this work can have some unintended but unfortunately predictable consequences. For example, property values tend to increase with complete streets improvements. This can be a great thing when you're trying to encourage economic growth and jobs and businesses in a neighborhood, but it's important to keep in mind that without partnerships with housing advocates, without proactive policies to reduce displacement, what we might see is that complete streets without those partnerships and policies could unintentionally result in displacement of the very people whose health, safety, and access to opportunity you intend to benefit. So I just ask that you keep that in mind for a more nuanced discussion moving forward. I'm going to pause there for a moment. I know that we have been talking quite a lot already, and I have much more to talk to you about before we're done today, but I do want to give you all a chance to react to what we've already shown you and to share some of what you're seeing with us. So our first discussion question is, how have complete streets benefited different neighborhoods and communities in Charlotte that you have observed? And the counter question implied here is, how have complete streets failed to benefit certain neighborhoods and communities? I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share for a moment so that we can see each other for a discussion, but I look forward to learning more from all of you about what you're seeing in terms of how complete streets have helped or left behind certain communities in Charlotte and the surrounding area. I see some comments in the chat. in regards to certain streets that have been constructed in Charlotte, I-85, Independence Boulevard, and I-77. Shannon, do you want to say any more about that?
Sure. Hey, everyone. Yeah, I was remembering when former Secretary of Transportation in Charlotte, native Charlotte Mayor Anthony Fox was the Secretary of Transportation. He did a national tour where he was sharing this information about the inequity of where highways were built around the country and including Charlotte. And he talked about the impact of Interstate 85 here in Charlotte being built right through the neighborhood where he grew up and how it divided his neighborhood and his neighbors. So that resonated with me, and I think it's an important history that not many people know. As Anthony Fox shared during his presentation, there's a reason there's no highways running through the most expensive real estate in Charlotte, which is Southeast Charlotte, Eastover, Myers Park, Elizabeth. Those residents had the affluence and the influence to prevent the construction of highways through their neighborhoods at the time. And Northwest Charlotte and the lower income parts of the city did not have that influence and that affluence. So, those roads that most of us take for granted today very much, did and still impact the lives of the people that live there. So I think that's an important local example.
Thank you for sharing that, Shannon. Does anyone else want to share any examples that they've observed in Charlotte in their work, in their personal lives, where the benefits of complete streets have or have not been distributed across communities?
All right, Cole.
Go ahead, Kenya.
Cole, my name is Kenya Templeton. I have been a car-free bike commuter full-time in Charlotte for 8 years up until last August, when it just became impossible to do so due to our transit. The average transit time one way to go to work for someone is an hour and a half. And then if you add on that most of our last mile, first miles are really not a mile, they're more like 3 to 5 miles. So at the last place that I lived, I had to bike 20 minutes, and that's biking. So someone who had to walk would take much longer. So I had to bike 20 minutes just to get to my bus stop. The big thing that I see lacking in my community, in the area that I live in, is that every part or every quadrant of Uptown or around Uptown connects to Uptown except the lowest income area, which is North Tryon, Statesville Avenue. Statesville Avenue is a little more connected, but North Tryon has a tremendous amount of people who work at like 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, and they could benefit from being able to bike to work, and there is no infrastructure to be able to do that. And even transit, they built the train, but the train doesn't go based on the hours that hourly people work. It goes more based on the hours that 9 to 5 people work.
Yeah,
That's it.
It's a really great point. Thank you very much for sharing that example. And you're right. I think we're going to focus most of today's conversation on walking and biking, but you're absolutely right to point out that transit similarly is distributed in a way that doesn't necessarily serve certain communities, especially the communities that depend on transit. We really allocate most of our space in our roadways to prioritize speed for vehicles, for personal vehicles and drivers. And we often don't allocate spaces effectively to transit or to walking and biking. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think someone else also wanted to weigh in. I see a couple of hands.
This is Terry Lansdale with Bike Walk North Carolina. I think the question was, how has Complete Streets impacted our community and how has it not? A couple things happened in Charlotte when we had our first road diet, which is really based upon Complete Streets model of building for all users on East Boulevard. From that point locally, there was such a demand across all sectors of regions, diversity, all sectors of Charlotte for more road diets. It overwhelmed our local municipalities' ability to fund and prioritize those projects. So much so that it became restrictive at the state level. so that there was actually conversation and language that passed to limit the ability of municipalities to perform road diets moving forward. So that's a real issue when we look at complete streets moving forward. I think we've got great success at the grassroots level, but at the grass tops level, a lot of energy needs to be directed to codify complete streets at the state level and have a unified voice at the state level to do so will affect a much greater impact and change, not only in urban environments like Mecklenburg County and the city of Charlotte, but across all counties in North Carolina. So keep that in mind as you take a closer look at North Carolina and understand the legislative restrictions associated with standalone bicycle projects and road diets and other complete streets policies. There has been some good stuff, but I wanted to make that link at the state level. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for sharing. Oh, go ahead, Dana.
This is Dana Stujenki. I actually work for the town of Matthews, which is right adjacent to the city of Charlotte. I don't know, I'm supposed to be on this call, but someone emailed me this link, so here I am. And so I just want to say that, I think it is correct that it's very hard at the top to try to get projects implemented that we practitioners really want to see complete streets. There's US 74 that runs from Charlotte into Matthews into Union County, and there's a massive project going on right now, it's supposed to be a $900 million overhaul of connector streets and of 74, and we're just having a really hard time with some of our trying to create ways to connect back the community from on the north side of 74 and the south side of 74. When they created that street, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and disconnecting our communities on the north side and the south side. So it's we practitioners, at least in Matthews and in Charlotte, I know are diligently working towards it, but it's obviously super costly, and it's very it's a bit maddening working with some of our partner agencies because they don't see the value in it. They want to get the cars. They're like, we want to spend those dollars on the cars. We don't want to spend them on other modes of transportation. So just my vent, get on my soapbox. So.
Well, thank you for being here and thank you for sharing that. I think both of you are very right in the points that you raised. Dana, to your point, I think having performance measures that actually measure the impact of projects that match the goals of the community is so important. Often we rely very much on a metric called level of service, which I suspect many of you have already heard of. And if you haven't, we're going to talk about that in greater detail in later modules. But we measure the success of our roads solely based on how well we can move vehicles without delay. And we don't think about the benefits to other users. And that really does get in the way of putting good projects in place. To the other point that was made, we're going to talk a bit today about the role of codifying complete streets in policy, and we're going to talk much more about project selection in module number 4. So thank you both for sharing those points. Before I relaunch the presentation, did anyone else want to share in response to this discussion question?
Hi, my name is Sri. I live in Blakeney area, and I do want to show the issue of access to open spaces and schools. I mean, of course, you'll have shown it as one of your priorities to connect, active places, everyday needs. And in Charlotte especially, which is really overgrown and it's, in kind of, in places that are not really infill and like that, but pretty distant from the urban core, the number of cars that are used by parents dropping off kids to school and kids driving to school themselves in high schools is tremendously large. In addition to that, access to open spaces is missing too. So the need for complete streets. But again, the issue of such a massive and robust program to satisfy a historically unprepared city and to do retrofits, it's a pretty expensive thing, and there has to be some practical way of measuring usage patterns. For example, the buses that are running, the X buses, the 62X buses and stuff like that. Those kind of buses have good measurable success. So, going by what is already in the last 10 years, an upward usage pattern will help, when you're trying to still retrofit and, come with that one central answer. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing, Shri. And I think you've really hit on an important point as well about activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. The everyday destinations piece is a very, very important part of this intervention. A sidewalk or a bike lane that leads to nowhere is not very helpful to anybody, but one that connects to schools, to open spaces and parks is much more valuable to a community and to the quality of life of people living within that community.
And the other problem is also, people not respecting red lights, and then the amount of fatalities we see among school kids now, and pedestrians, even in places that, we do have the level of service, the amount of people ready to, not follow these rules and regulations is so high. So some kind of a enforced discipline through CMS is also a good, is also a good answer to, in places where, relatively level of service is not bad really. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think the issue of enforcement is a very complicated one, because I think as we're really seeing play out now in the national conversation, enforcement has been used as a tool of violence against certain communities, especially Black communities. We'll talk a bit more in the second module about the role that street design can play in encouraging people to adhere to speed limits, to slow down and stop at intersections. There's a lot that can actually be done through engineering. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next module. I'm going to keep us moving for the sake of time, but if you didn't get a chance to weigh in, please feel free to put your thoughts into the comments and we'll return to them, and we'll have other discussion questions as well for folks to weigh in on before the end of the module. But for now, I believe it was Shannon that made the point that in many cases, these major interstates carved through communities and as a result exposed them to what I talked about earlier, these dangerously high speeds, this disconnect from resources just across an uncrossable street, the exposure to air pollutants. But other communities had influence and affluence, I believe were Shannon's words. Other communities had access to a system to protest those roads, those investments in their communities. So what I want to talk about now is a topic that we're not going to go into too much detail in future modules, but one that I think is so important to how decisions are made, not just in transportation, but in all aspects of the built environment. And that is inequity that is really built into outreach and engagement. So I want to talk about a few barriers to outreach. I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. Who leads the meeting? When and where does that take place? How and where are the invitations shared? I want to note that when I say meeting here, I might be talking about a hearing about a specific project. I might be talking about broader planning initiatives related to comprehensive plans. Really, this is how do the priorities of the community inform decisions that are made by government agencies? And the answer is that not everybody's voices are reaching decision makers, and that creates a lot of problems related to inequity. Starting with who leads the meeting. I mentioned just now that law enforcement has unfortunately really served as a tool of violence against Black communities, and that creates a really hostile, unwelcoming environment. When you lead a meeting with people who don't provide that welcoming space to share your thoughts, it's no surprise that people who feel unsafe don't show up. That doesn't just affect Black communities, that also affects immigrant communities, and it's something really important to keep in mind. If your goal in hosting a public engagement is to learn about community priorities, you need to do that in a way that is approachable and welcoming to the community you're trying to reach. One such tool is to make sure that the folks leading the meeting are folks that are either members of the community or that have shared experiences or similar experiences at least, people who really can create that welcoming, culturally relevant environment to share thoughts and priorities. And I'll note here, and we'll bring this back up again later, particularly if your goal is equity for previously underserved communities, you're going to want to pay community leaders for their time and expertise in these cases. This is a point that I just want to bring up in relation to what I said earlier about decisions like the national highway system that have not had the best interest of certain communities in mind. Some research out of Rutgers University in New Jersey has found that Black and Hispanic Latinx communities have actually self-reported that lack of access to political power has been one of their major barriers to cycling. They feel like their voices aren't heard by political leadership. In fact, more than half believe that even if they did advocate for specific improvements, they believe that the government isn't going to listen to them. What we're seeing is that communities who have not been served by government in the past don't trust government to serve them now. And that makes sense. And it's really important to keep in mind if you want to build trust moving forward so that you can make improvements to communities, you can help to improve quality of life and to reduce these health and safety disparities that we've been talking about today. When and where does the meeting take place? Well, in the time of COVID, probably online. But I do want you to keep in mind a few key points for when we do resume in-person meetings, and even when we hold meetings online like this. Not everyone has the luxury of free time to attend a meeting. I actually think that Kenya made a really good point earlier about the amount of time it takes for somebody to commute via transit. Let's say you're holding a meeting in person, but that meeting takes place in a location that you really need to have a car to drive to safely, or that it would take you that hour and a half to get there on transit. If that meeting is supposed to help you make decisions and understand priorities for walking and biking, but that meeting is almost impossible to attend for people who rely on walking and biking and transit to get around, then you're not really getting a good representation of the community that you're trying to serve. Similarly, it's not just a matter of where that meeting takes place, but when. This is something that applies even if a meeting is virtual. Are you holding that meeting at a time that only people that work 9-to-5 jobs can attend, or that people that work 9-to-5 jobs cannot attend? Often the answer is to hold meetings at a variety of times that are convenient for the people whose input you're trying to collect, and to hold them in a way that is approachable and accessible to those people. I'll also note that considering we've moved a lot of this work to an online environment, think through whether or not the Charlotte metropolitan area broadly has widespread access to broadband and high-speed internet. Is that another barrier to participation that is going to make it hard for people to weigh in on these decisions? How and where are meeting invitations shared? Are they being posted on social media platform that is predominantly used by one community but not another? Are they being shared, translated into the languages that members of your community speak? There's a lot of ways that we've approached community engagement in the past as a perfunctory checkbox, all right, well, we'll just do this because we're required to. And it has made it difficult, if not impossible, for many communities to participate. And that's something that can be overcome if you really think through the needs of your community. Who are you missing when you collect this information? And how can you better reach them moving forward? That's something that is really going to be very different depending on the community that you're working with. This is not something that has a one-size-fits-all answer. And even within Charlotte, I suspect the different communities will require different tactics and techniques to better reach them and to make sure that they feel comfortable sharing their voices and perspectives. And most importantly, making sure that that perspective is then actually acted upon and valued moving forward in decision making. I'm not going to talk too much about community engagement itself. I just want to leave these questions before you to think through as you move forward with your own work and as we move forward with these conversations. Is childcare provided? Obviously, in a COVID online world, this question is perhaps phrased incorrectly. But I'm sure many of you probably are struggling to balance working from home and whatever civic engagement you participate in at home with parenting and now schooling. It's a real factor to consider. And when you are having in-person meetings, there are actually really great ways to not just invite children to come, but to actually have fun activities for children to participate in so that they too can have a voice in how their community develops moving forward. When you are hosting engagement, whether that's online or in person, are you providing interpretation, say sign language or closed captioning for people living with complete or partial deafness? Are you providing translation in real time into the other languages that are spoken in your community? Are the actual engagement methods that you're using accessible and culturally relevant? Do people feel like they can see themselves not just in whatever project or plan you're discussing, but also in the engagement methods you're using? And finally, are community leaders and local experts fairly compensated for their time? One more point that I want to make before I move on, related to really the second and third bullet here, is also consider if you're working with a community that has either low literacy or perhaps members of the community don't feel as confident either speaking publicly or writing in English. There are a lot of really great ways that people can participate and share input that don't rely so much on standing up in front of a crowd or writing out feedback. You can accomplish a lot through things like visual preference surveys, where people can vote on images, things like that that are really easy to understand even without a mastery of the English language. And I think it's something that is often missed or not thought of when trying to make decisions about complete streets and other interventions. And as a result, you're really working based on a very incomplete understanding of the community that you're trying to serve. I'm going to pause here as well for another discussion. I see a lot happening in the chat, and I'd love a chance to read that. And I'd also love to get your thoughts on how community engagement is going in Charlotte. How do you currently approach community engagement in your work? Are you encountering the barriers that I mentioned, or have you already found a lot of ways to overcome them when working with the communities that you hope to benefit through Complete Streets?
Well, and I know we had a great example, and I don't know if Kenya, you'd like to talk about it here, but I appreciate you sharing the example from Hidden Valley. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? I think maybe that'd be a great way to start the conversation, to hear a specific example.
Yeah, so the
Thank
Cross
you.
Charlotte Trail is a trail that's supposed to go from southern Charlotte actually into South Carolina, into the northern part of Mecklenburg County. We're in the process of building and designing the northern part, and there were discussions placed in different communities. The number one problem, going back to one of the things you talked about, was how was that being distributed? No one on my street knew anything about it. I took it upon myself to go house to house, and I was new to my community, so people at first were looking at me like I was crazy. They put really small signs on a state street, where a state highway on North Tryon, where people go usually 50 miles per hour, though they're supposed to be 35. So people aren't going to see these small, like 10 by 14, 10 by 20 signs that they had up. And they had the meeting at Chagall Presbyterian Church, which is technically not in Hidden Valley, and it's a white church. Though Hidden Valley is a predominantly low-income, person of color neighborhood. And then when we got into the area, I noticed, as a bicycle commuter at the time, there was no bicycle parking. Most people only have one car, and that one car is used for the person that goes to work. So people were having to cross a 4 to 6 lane street to get to this meeting. I could keep going on and on. But that gives you sort of an idea of the problems. And another problem I wanted to indicate that you also talked about that Charlotte does a lot of is collecting data, but not collecting data including everyone. And it's always in certain parts of town, so it doesn't include the experience of all of the community.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
This is Meg. I can share a experience from Sustain Charlotte's perspective. Several years ago, we started partnering with the West Boulevard Neighborhood Coalition following the traffic death of an 11-year-old girl who was hit and killed by a car while crossing the street. And the residents got together, and we really worked and had a good partnership with Charlotte DOT as they did the corridor study of West Boulevard. And the residents together asked to meet with the CDOT planners more often than would typically be done in a corridor study. And that really enabled the residents to have that constant interaction with Charlotte DOT so that there weren't any surprises when the recommendations came out, and CDOT planners were able to go back to the table several times during that process to refine the recommendations. So I think that was an example of a positive partnership that did improve upon the past. And we continue to partner with neighborhoods throughout Charlotte. We do have a new transportation coalition that does have funding for neighborhood leaders to be able to provide things like childcare or stipends to neighborhood leaders who participate and lead. So, you know, I just want to say that we're continuing to do that work and always looking for ways to get better at it. So thank you so much for these guidelines.
And thank you for sharing that example. It sounds like a lot of progress is being made to overcome some of these barriers. And I guess the caveat or the point that I'll acknowledge is that it takes a very long time to build trust where previously it has not been earned. Even if you're doing the right things now, a community that has seen decisions made against their interests may not right away trust that your good intentions are going to lead to good outcomes. It's a long process to overcome trust that has been really neglected over generations. But having the work that you're doing now, having community leaders directly involved and compensated is a really important start. And I think to Kenya's point, holding meetings in gathering spaces that are already a staple in the community, not a staple in someone else's community, can go a long way as well. Does anyone else want to share anything about their experiences, either delivering or participating in community engagement or lack thereof?
Hi, this is Chris Danis, and I'm from Charlotte East. I live on an East Side resident, and echoing what I'm hearing here today, we are part of the Transit Coalition that Sustain Charlotte is working on, along with the West Side neighborhood in the Northeast. And typically, the North-South communities may have a better transit and greenway trail than the East-West connectivity in Charlotte. The East-West seems to be lacking, even with the Cross Charlotte Trail or Cross Charlotte Trail 2, which we talk about is the cross north, south, east, west. So it's good that we're moving forward in recognition of that. And as a neighborhood, one of the challenges is the many languages and diversity of the East Side. So it is a large Latinx population, 33% compared to 13% in the rest of the county. And so it's the most diverse part of the city. So it's important when we do this outreach that we do it in multiple languages and do it on the ground and come out to the people and meet with them. And I think that's where we're headed with the Transit Coalition. So exciting work ahead.
Hi. So I have typed this in, but one of the ways of reaching out to people who cannot speak English, which is probably now about 30 to 40% of Charlotte, really. Even in Blakeney, which is South Charlotte, that issue is there, and the complete disinterest in participating in democratic endeavors to, whether it is comprehensive plan or anything which with CADS is the issue of language. And I'm wondering whether CMS will kind of incorporate something which Sustain Charlotte can roll out in the future, where at least middle school and high school kids go back home with some kind of a questionnaire and fill it out on behalf of their parents and themselves to give a good idea of what needs are there among the populations that are not that do not speak English properly. So I'm wondering that whether CMS can help this situation out, and in that process also help with how their own how each school comes to how each population comes to their respective schools in their respective areas without the dependability of a bus. Especially in COVID situations, the biggest issue now we are facing is transportation by bus. So many people went on remote just because they don't want the kids to ride the bus. So there's two aspects of this. One is having big issues getting solved through relatively small questionnaires distributed among the populations that are learning English in East Charlotte and other areas. And B is the issue of transportation to schools too. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Shri. I think you're right that the school system can be a very, very strong and powerful partner when it comes to complete streets. Off the top of my head, the example that comes to mind is work that we did with the city of Pittsburgh. Their county health department already had a partnership with the school system to talk about health behaviors, to talk about how to navigate the street safely. So when the city of Pittsburgh noticed that one of the streets directly leading to the school was a really problematic and dangerous space for people walking along and across the street, and they decided to do a demonstration project to improve the safety of that street and to provide protected places to cross, they worked with the school system and the county health department to engage both students and parents through the school. And it really led to a much stronger, broader project than what they would have envisioned on their own without that input from the community. So definitely, I think there's a lot of opportunities to partner with the school system, especially if it's a complete streets project that relates to safe routes to school or safe routes to parks near schools and so on. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. Yes, and the bigger issues are the household access to stuff, because many kids speak English, but parents do not. And that's a sizable, very, very big sizable population in Charlotte, more than you can even imagine. Meg herself has pointed out that about 30% of Charlotte does not drive. So those kind of hidden problems can be addressed through this, this questionnaire. I think kids will do a good job because they do want to go places. They don't want to be stuck in their homes like these times in COVID, they're even not being able to go to school in fall. So I think kids will do a marvelous job, and I think it'll also reduce traffic deaths due to teenage driving in Charlotte, especially given the current situations that many people are not going through driving lessons. And we probably add many more kids on the road every few months here than any in any place developing at a lesser rate. So we are developing in such a bigger rate in many areas of Charlotte that we add more drivers per few months, and all these add in the education. Thank you.
Thank you, Shri. Does anyone else want to weigh in on outreach and engagement before I move on?
Hey, real quick, this is Shannon again with Sustain. I'll just add that this is something we are actively always, I would say, are always trying to do better, and we're doing some work on that right now. In fact, we have a board meeting tonight. We'll be discussing some new approaches that our team, our staff have come up with that we're going to share with our board for feedback to try to improve the inclusivity of our engagement. So this is work that we're actively doing right now, and is always top of mind for us.
Glad to hear it. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Shannon.
All right, hearing no other voices weighing in, I'm going to move on to the final section of today's introductory presentation. We're going to talk just a little bit about codifying equity and codifying complete streets, namely the benefits of a complete streets policy. Some of this information might be familiar to you because Charlotte does in fact have a complete streets policy already. And I suspect some of you on the call may have been intimately involved in the adoption of that policy, or at least in its implementation today. But nonetheless, because this is an introductory module, I want to make sure everyone is on the same page. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the very basics of a complete streets policy. If you have very specific information about how this pertains to Charlotte to share, I absolutely invite you to chime in while I am speaking. I would love to hear from you. First, to start, Emily made a point earlier that complete streets is not a product, it's a process. But in communities that aren't as familiar with complete streets, when we ask what does complete streets mean, often the answer is the project itself, is the one street you can think of with a bike lane and a sidewalk and a crosswalk, or a bus stop. The thing is, if you think about complete streets this way, the widespread benefits that Emily discussed earlier and the disparities that I spoke about earlier are not going to progress in the way that you think or hope. An individual complete streets project perhaps can lead to some benefits for those living immediately in the vicinity or working immediately in the vicinity, but really the broader benefits of complete streets related to health and well-being, and certainly the broader benefits related to activity-friendly routes and access to opportunities, are not going to be realized from one individual project. They're going to be realized when those projects form a complete network that allows people to access parks and open spaces, jobs, schools, churches, recreation centers, friends' homes, grocery stores, doctors' offices, all of these everyday destinations within reach through any of a number of ways of traveling, including walking, biking, transit, or driving. Having that complete network, that network that you can safely and comfortably traverse to get wherever you need to go, is so important to health, to safety, to well-being, and to equity. You don't get there one project at a time. You don't get there by fighting the same uphill battle over and over and over again, starting from the bottom of the hill each time, that fight to just include just a little bit more funding for bike lanes as an extra feature. That's not complete streets, and that is a really, really long and hard-fought battle to get a complete network. The way that you achieve that network is by embedding complete streets in your everyday decision-making for every transportation project. And that starts with a policy. That starts with a policy that changes the way that planners, engineers, decision makers, electeds, and community members think about streets from the onset, not as pathways for cars that also accommodate other uses, but as spaces that balance the needs of all people and all users. This happens by adopting policies that actually change the day-to-day practices and decision-making of transportation departments, and that cascades to other decision-making practices as well, such as the community engagement and outreach that we just discussed. So how do policies lay the groundwork for implementation? Unfortunately, not all complete streets policies are created equally. Emily mentioned when introducing me that I play a role in grading complete streets policies for our annual Best Complete Streets Policies report. We do that using a tool that we call the 10 elements of a complete streets policy. I'm going to talk you through much of that content now, albeit in a slightly different format, and we'll share that resource with you after this module if you want to learn more. But what we see is that when we talk about complete streets policies, we're talking about a very, very wide variety of policies. Some are going to do all of the things in this pyramid that I will talk you through in a moment. Many are what we have occasionally come to call press release policies. They affirm in words, non-binding words without next steps, that complete streets is a great idea, and the council members that adopt the policy like that idea. That's it. They don't actually change anything about the approach to making decisions about streets individually. They don't change anything about the approach to deciding which projects to fund and how to spend that funding. They're just an endorsement in resolution format, a thumbs up to complete streets with no meaningful action afterwards. Fortunately, Charlotte's policy doesn't look like that. Charlotte's policy falls somewhere in between those top two rungs, but nonetheless, it is something that we see very commonly. And really, what we've also seen is that the communities that do really have strong complete streets implementation, the communities that have a robust and safe and complete network of sidewalks and crosswalks, of bike lanes, of transit service with first mile, last mile, and that first mile really being a mile or less, those communities have policies that have really worked to embed complete streets in every possible decision point made by leadership, by community members throughout. So how does that happen? Well, it starts with a core commitment. And for those press release policies, I talked about, it kind of stops here as well. But that core commitment really sets forth a vision for complete streets. You know, what does complete streets actually mean for Charlotte or for your community? And that is creating a complete network. That means balancing the needs and priorities of all people who use the street, regardless of age, ability, income, race, ethnicity, gender, mode of transportation. It really starts to set forth what the goals of complete streets are for your community. Which of the benefits that we discussed earlier are the motivation for pursuing complete streets? Is it about reducing health disparities? Is it about stimulating economic development? Is it about safety and saving lives on your street? This vision can help to kind of establish why complete streets matters as a priority for your community. The next steps are, how is complete streets going to actually be applied? How is this core commitment going to be realized? And this happens in a number of ways. The first is all projects and phases. Every single transportation project is an opportunity to make complete streets improvements. This does not just happen when you're building a brand new road. This happens, as folks have already mentioned, through retrofits, when you are maintaining or reconstructing or just repaving a street. That is often the most cost-effective opportunity to improve complete streets. For example, in the case of bike lanes, you're already repaving a street, you're already repainting the lanes. It's a great opportunity to practice what some folks mentioned earlier, which is a road diet. I suspect many of you on this call know what that means, but just in case you don't, a road diet is taking a street that perhaps has, let's say, 4 or 5 very generously wide lanes for vehicles. Perhaps that's more space than is actually needed to efficiently move that traffic. What if instead of 4 or 5 lanes, we just had 2 or 3? What if we narrowed those lanes? That frees up a lot of space that could be allocated to other uses, whether that's pull-off space for buses, bike lanes, wider sidewalks, perhaps even cafe seating for nearby restaurants. The point is that every project is an opportunity, even routine repavement, to improve the street network and to rebalance that space for all people who use that street. The next way that the Complete Streets policy can apply broadly is with a clear process for granting exceptions. Not every single street needs to be a complete street, and that's okay. As long as you have thought through, both on a small and large scale, how to create that complete network, how to create those really important connections between the places where people live and the places where they work, eat, socialize, recreate. It's okay if not every single street fits the bill. What's important, though, is that those exceptions are clear, that they don't create these gaping loopholes that make it possible for every single project to not be a complete street. They also need to have a really clear approval process, ideally one that gives the community a chance to weigh in before a decision is made. And there needs to be some clear justification for why this street doesn't need to be a complete street to avoid creating that loophole I mentioned. Finally, jurisdiction. In the case of a city or county level policy, that means that projects that are undertaken by private developers are not exempt from complete streets. When this happens, and perhaps you've seen examples like the one I'm about to describe in your own community, for example, with sidewalks, this is how you end up with that patchwork of there's a sidewalk here and then it ends, and then there's a goat trail in the dirt, and then the sidewalk picks up again on the other end of this property. When you let private developers have a pass, that's how you end up with gaps in your network. That's how you end up with sidewalks that lead to nowhere and bike lanes that just dump a cyclist into the middle of a busy road suddenly and without warning. It also means that you need to partner with surrounding communities. Complete streets don't end at town boundaries, neither do trips, neither do our lives. So working with your surrounding jurisdictions and working with your overlapping jurisdictions, your county, your region, your state, is also really important to the success of that complete network. The meat of implementation comes in the binding steps that a policy calls for. This is where you actually embed changes in your day-to-day decisions in order to allow complete streets to move forward. Without these binding steps, you have an idea in policy form, but the standard approach doesn't change, and it gets in the way of actually doing this work. So what are these binding steps? I'm going to give you a broad overview of them, and we're going to talk about some of them in greater detail later. Revising processes, just very broadly. Whatever standard decision-making practices you have, whatever pipeline that projects move through, are there barriers to complete streets built into that pipeline? And if so, can you change them so that rather than getting in the way, these processes help you implement complete streets as a matter of routine? This includes things like your broader planning as well as individual projects. Design guidelines. I know that Charlotte has a really strong urban street design guidance that helps to clarify what complete streets could or should look like in different contexts. Not every complete street looks exactly the same, and that is absolutely okay. In fact, that's the goal. They should respond to the context of the neighborhood that they run through or the uses that surround them. Having design guidelines that make it really clear what they could or should look like helps take some of the uncertainty out. And when it comes to funding for projects, uncertainty is often what leads to things like bike lanes being removed because, oh, well, we don't really know what it's going to look like anyway. We don't want to spend the money. Let's just take it out. We see this time and time again, and having clear design guidance, especially context-sensitive guidance, can help to remove that snag in the process. Performance measures. I mentioned this briefly, and we're going to talk about this a lot in probably most, if not all, of the modules. But how do you define the success of your streets? How do you track and measure and report that success? I'm sure many, if not all of you, have heard the expression, what gets measured gets done. If the only performance measure that decision makers care about is congestion for drivers, it's going to be really difficult to implement complete streets. But what measures matter most to your community? Is it safety? Is it health? Is it economic development? Is it some combination of all of them? Having formally adopted performance measures that actually reflect your priorities helps to make sure that the decisions that you make advance those same priorities. We are going to talk so much about project selection in module number 4 because this is a really important decision point in the process. There is not, and there may never be enough funding to implement every project that is important to creating your complete network. So the way that you decide how to allocate that limited funding, the way that you decide which neighborhoods are going to get complete streets projects, that is one of the most important decisions that is made. And sometimes that decision is made by the vocal minority that complains. Sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that is how you perpetuate those disparities I showed you earlier, where higher income neighborhoods have more sidewalks and crosswalks and lighting than lower income ones. Having project selection criteria that consider equity is one really important way that you can change that. And like I said, we're going to talk about this very specifically. I'll give you some specific examples of how communities like Chattanooga have changed their project selection to make sure that their money goes where they actually want it to go to advance their priorities. Community engagement. We talked about this a little bit already, and some of you have shared really powerful examples of how community engagement has failed to actually reach groups or how it is changing to make sure that their voices are heard moving forward. And this is something that can be embedded in a policy. A policy can call for community engagement to be revisited, or it's something that can happen on its own. But the fact that it happens at all is really important if you truly want to create a complete network that serves your community, not just the parts of your community that are already vocal. And finally, ongoing trainings like what we're doing today. If you have adopted the greatest design guidance and policy in the world, but nobody that's actually implementing it understands it, well, they're gonna have a tough time implementing it. So just having some kind of process to make sure that the best practices are actually disseminated to the people that are going to make these decisions or the people that are going to support and advocate for them is also really important. And finally, the last piece, oversight. Do you have some mechanism in place to make sure that those binding steps actually happen? Is there some documented accountability? What I mean is, are you actually sharing information about these steps and how they're progressing with the public, either through the mail, online, at meetings in public parks, whatever the case may be? Is there some way that the public can actually learn about what you're doing and make sure that you're doing it? Hard deadlines. This one's really simple. I know that I am a procrastinator. It really helps me to have a deadline, to know I have to do something by a certain date. Well, in the case of a complete streets policy, it's not just about preventing that procrastination. It's about accountability. It's about making sure that, you know, like having a hard deadline written out, like we're going to update our zoning ordinance by this date. It provides a mechanism for advocates to challenge a jurisdiction if they're not doing what they said they would. Without a deadline, you could say, oh, well, we're working on that. You could be working on that for decades. A hard deadline is a really, really helpful tool for accountability. It's a short bit of language in a policy, but it is a powerful one. Cross-departmental, this kind of speaks for itself, but as I'm sure many of you know already, Complete Streets touches on so many aspects of not just the built environment, but of people's lives. Are the folks in Parks and Recreation, are the folks in the transit agency, are the folks in public health at the table helping to make these decisions? If so, the implementation rather of your complete network is going to be a lot stronger. And related to that, inclusive membership. By membership, I mean, let's say that your policy has some kind of body, some committee that is actually overseeing Complete Streets. If you really want to see your Complete Streets implementation move forward in a way that doesn't just benefit, but prioritizes communities that have historically been left behind, it absolutely helps to make sure that those communities are represented in this oversight or decision-making body. That could include low-income BIPOC neighborhoods and leaders from those neighborhoods. That could include members of the disability community or older adults. Whatever the case may be, it is going to vary with each community, but making sure that the people who you want to serve have a voice in guiding those decisions is a really, really, really important step. I see tons of activity in the chat, and that is great. I am about to stop talking and turn it over to you for questions and to share whatever examples you have shared already. But before I do, I just want to quickly say that following this module, we're going to make sure that we share quite a few resources with you. We are recording all of these. We are also going to share PDFs of these presentations, and we can provide links to some of the resources that we have talked about today, such as the elements of a Complete Streets policy or Dangerous by Design and others. If you have resources from your organizations that you think are relevant to share, do feel free to include those links in the comments as well, and we will do our best to compile and share those with others on the call. And with that, I am going to stop this presentation and check out the examples you all have shared in the chat and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Cole. And I think, you know, questions, comments, I think there was a lot of good conversation happening in the chat box. So it would be great to hear a little bit more. For example, there was a conversation happening around Parkwood and vehicle volumes. Could we hear a little bit more about that from the group? I think Shannon, you
Sure.
and
Yeah, this is
Christina
Shannon
were
again.
talking about it.
I hate to dominate the conversation, but this is obviously a topic very near and dear to our hearts at Sustain Charlotte. So we partnered with several neighborhoods that front Parkwood Avenue that are actually divided by Parkwood Avenue back in 2015 after an elderly cyclist was hit and killed by a car while taking his laundry on his bicycle to the laundromat. There was an outpouring of concern from the cycling community, yet there was not a commitment by the city to improve the safety of that road in response. And so we helped the neighborhoods create a petition asking the city to do a road diet on Parkwood, which is a 4-lane road with no bicycle lanes, back of curb sidewalks, high speeds, blind corners. It's kind of a perfect storm for danger and death. And as a result of that, the city did do a corridor study, and based on their models and vehicle volumes, as I was saying in the chat, did agree to road diet Parkwood Avenue itself. The petition was for both Parkwood Avenue and a portion of a street called the Plaza. Parkwood essentially turns into a street called the Plaza. It's really the same street with different names at different points. And the portion of the street that's called the Plaza, they did not agree to road diet, even though it had more fatalities and serious injuries than Parkwood, because the vehicle volumes were higher than what they considered feasible for a road diet. So we were excited that the Parkwood portion of the road is being road dieted. In fact, its construction is supposed to finally begin this year after 5 years of planning and advocacy on our part and the city's part, the planning at least, and the neighborhood's advocacy. So it's been a 5-year battle, but we're still disappointed that the upper portion of the road, the Plaza portion, is not being road dieted as people continue to be hit and killed, both cyclists, mainly pedestrians, but also cyclists on that portion of the road. So hopefully we'll see a drop in of violence on Parkwood after this road diet is finally done, which hopefully will lead to improvements on the more dangerous section, which is the Plaza. So that's what we were talking about.
Thank you for sharing that, Shannon. It looks like there's also a question in the chat. Most projects are in the queue for several years. What is the process to address new issues or new suggestions during the execution of a project? I can speak to what we see generally across the country, and then perhaps someone who's more intimately familiar with the project delivery process in Charlotte can also weigh in with some specifics. Unfortunately, what we typically see in the standard box checking version of community engagement and project delivery is, yes, that project is in the queue for several years, but by the time that project actually comes before the community for input, it's already pretty far along in its design. And really what they're looking for is either affirmation that the design is good, or if there are complaints, really at that point only minor tweaks to pretty major decisions about the goals of the project that have already been made. So the process.
Cool. On that note, that's exactly what happened with Parkwood.
Yeah.
The neighborhoods are very upset with the final design, but they've been told it's essentially too late. They've agreed to very minor tweaks, but the neighborhood leaders feel that the design has many fatal flaws. Mm-hmm. And the response from the project manager at the city is essentially, it's too late, we're going to construction. And there's a lot of hurt feelings around that. So what you just said is exactly what happened on Parkwood. Yeah. It's obviously a huge improvement over what we have today, but it falls far short of what the community asked for. So thanks for that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I wish that wasn't the case. I would rather if you said, no, you're wrong. Actually, we do it great in Charlotte, but it's a very real challenge in many communities. Charlotte's not alone in that. I know of two strategies that can perhaps not completely overcome this barrier, but certainly improve upon it. One is to bring the community on board earlier, before you have already made major decisions about the overarching design of a project and the, how the budget of that project is going to be spent. You can bring the community in much sooner to actually help you identify not just what the solution could look like, but how they perceive, what they perceive the problems to be in that space that you're redesigning. Having the community on board before any decisions are made can vastly improve the approach to that project design. Another solution that we've seen have a lot of success in communities is to do a demonstration project first. These are really low cost, quick to implement projects. You may have heard them referred to as quick builds or as tactical urbanism. They're an opportunity to test out a street design in space before committing to permanent and more expensive infrastructure. It gives the community a chance to actually experience what the project will look and feel like on the ground before it is permanent. It can be a really important way to improve upon the design and to get feedback based on how it actually operates once it's put into place. So that is one possible solution, but like I said, it's not a perfect solution, and it's not necessarily something that is going to work for every single project. I don't know if others want to weigh in on the challenges related to that, the community coming in too late to actually influence decisions, or the project moving too slowly to respond to emerging needs.
Can I add a thought?
Please do.
Sure. So I'm Faith Buda. I am a doctoral student at UNC Charlotte, and what we notice, at least specifically here in Charlotte, is that our population just has exponential growth. And so we have housing issues. We also have transportation issues. We just added an HOV lane, which depending on where you live, you may or may not like. But I think what happens is when projects do take years here in Charlotte, the demographics and the gentrification of some neighborhoods and parts of the city are just changing so rapidly that maybe the input that was there initially, if it was asked for, is just different at this point in time. So it is like, oh, maybe in our initial stage, we got this input from the community, but now that might not be representative of the current community. So I think that's one of the major challenges we face here is with such a growing population, how do we stay at speed with their changing needs?
It's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that, Faith. Are there any other questions? Go ahead.
I just wanted to add, I think if we can involve the community early in the policy part, especially in the core commitment and getting the vision correct, that, instead of, like you were mentioning, attacking every single project that comes up, if we can agree on those and get solid, high quality standards put in place for what, the policy is and how it's executed, and the community is involved in that process, then that should kind of eliminate some of these, what we're facing currently. Sure.
Thank you for sharing that, Eric. Other questions or other stories, anecdotes, examples to share that any of the content of today's presentation brought to mind for you?
Couple of things that I, in building to this idea of vision is priorities. What do you vision your city to be? Do you want this to be a city of people with high needs of families and a structure as such where there's many people who are having school going kids and early college going students, or are you perceiving this as a town, which is a town that people come from outside and like to enjoying the plazas and so in the vision itself there seems to be a kind of build up slowly happening as to what exactly do you envisage as Charlotte to be 20 years from now? And one of the ways to probably look at this is to see the census, which is coming up, because that will give you a fair amount of difference in what you thought in 10 years ago what Charlotte was, and what is Charlotte right now, and where is it going ahead. And that also ties to gentrification, because as in South Charlotte, and people moving out to Union County in search of schools, because our schools are overcrowded here. So it kind of solves issues from the visioning itself. Just to be able to see the census and understand what has happened in the community from last 10 years, and what are the places where the investments need to be going, and if plazas, what kind of plazas, if you need a Discovery Place extension, how big has it to be, those kind of issues, and addressing the issue of sustainability, which is so much tied with equity, is important at this stage with open spaces and complete streets and everything. But so what are we trying to do in the visioning itself is very important, and I think the census will give an answer. And the second way of things that has been happening as to identifying issues of problems like people dying on streets, and various issues that are not at all isolated, and one rule says too, one incident says too much. So for that, there are ways that probably city is probably now coming up with things like, I think today evening there's a virtual session on how neighborhoods can come together, and how the leaderships of neighborhoods can pool in diverse communities together. I think there's a virtual engagement. I'll try and type in the link in the chat session. So that would be a good place, because that also gives Sustain Charlotte a place where you can depend on leaderships which actually have some kind of teeth in their own neighborhoods, because the trust is built around, even if the communities are diverse, which is pretty much now, probably 80% of the communities in Charlotte. So that's the bottom up approach, where at the grassroots you have some HOAs and leaderships in communities which will speak up for everybody, and people will show their trust and come together because because they are trained and educated on some things, and that can be the other side of the vision too. So I'm just giving you two different aspects, but visioning is a very good idea irrespective.
Thank you for sharing that, Shri.
Thank you.
Hey, Shannon, again, just one comment. I just made this in the chat, but just to elaborate a little bit, I think it's worth noting that, how engaged the affected communities are does depend on the transportation staff that are leading the project as well. I mean, I've cited some examples with Parkwood, not being a shining example, I think, of great engagement, but the West Boulevard example that we spoke about earlier, there was great engagement. And CDOT was having very frequent meetings with the neighborhood coalition. It was very much a collaborative process. And at the end of that study, the neighborhood felt really good about the recommendations that CDOT was making. And as I mentioned in the chat, the first one of those recommendations is finally getting built, I think, as we speak, which is a pedestrian improvement. And so, I think like everything in life, people involved make a big difference. I hate to I don't want to paint the whole city with a broad brush. There are certain folks within the city and, state DOT who are fantastic and are, really champions and great at community engagement and prioritize it. And then there's others that, that's not really something they're as interested in. So I think there's a nuance there, and not all projects unroll in the same way because they're run by different people.
That's a really great point, and I think it speaks to one of the very important realities of this work. Transportation work, built environment work especially, moves slowly. So having those individual champions, those individual staff at CDOT or the planning department or the project managers that do really care about complete streets or sustainability or equitable engagement is important. It helps you figure out what works in your community. But without any kind of policy or formal practice to codify that, what happens when that champion moves on to another job or another role? Staff turnover can be a big barrier to this work as well. And leadership turnover and elected official turnover especially can be a big barrier to this work. So having those champions is so important to establish those best practices customized to your community. But codifying them is also really important to make sure that those practices are applied consistently by different staff and survive those staff if they leave to go to other jurisdictions or jobs.
Great points. Agree.
We have a few more minutes. If anybody else would like to comment or have any questions based on the content shared today. We've had a really robust conversation. So thank you all for being part of the conversation. Just give another opportunity if anyone wants to jump in, or we're running up against time and it's almost time to wrap up. And I see that Meg has posted in the chat box, it's not too late to invite your friends, neighbors, and colleagues to join us for the next 3 modules. So I'll just go ahead and shift into the wrap up, which first I'd really like to thank Cole for your excellent presentation and all the information, really a great approach. And we'll be seeing Cole again for our 4th module. Cole has been working closely with the team on the ground to prepare a case study that I think we're all going to find really interesting. So we will hear more from Cole next week. This week, we will be following up on Thursday with another module. And as you can see, you can share that link with others to join us this Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will be launching the module on designing for active transportation and land use. As I said before, our colleagues Beth Osborne and Chris Zimmerman will be leading that module. It's going to be really interesting. I invite you all and encourage you all to join us here again on Thursday so we can continue the conversation. As I said before, and I just want to keep emphasizing, this is interactive. I love that everyone is comfortable in the chat box. Thanks for the claps. And please just remember, when you come back, be ready to share. If you have any thoughts, we'll have a little time in the beginning to debrief from the conversation today. And really, we want to make sure that this is a learning exchange as much as possible. Again, you've heard it mentioned a few times, the recordings of this presentation, the PDFs of the presentations, resources that we are mentioning will all be compiled in a resource folder that we will be sure to share with all of the participants. So don't be too worried about that. We are going to organize that as we go, and we'll be sharing all of that information with you all. And please do remember that the more that you share with us about what's happening in Charlotte, the more that we can have this interactive conversation, the better our recommendations are going to be after these 4 days of an interactive workshop. So please remember that all of this is leading to our recommendations and next steps for your community. And so we want to make sure that those are as relevant and as effective as possible. And I've heard a few come out of the conversation today, so looking forward to hearing more as we go forward. And with that, unless anyone else has anything else to say, I will wrap up for the day. I want to thank everyone again. I hope you have a happy, healthy afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you here again on Thursday for our next module in designing for active transportation and land use. So thank you all. Take care, be well, and see you soon.